Okay, last chapter we looked at the demand for labor, and now we can take it a step further and look at how wages are determined. Okay, so wages include the price paid for labor and also fringe benefits, meaning health insurance, any type of retirement benefits, paid vacations, etc. So the wage rate is the price paid per unit of labor services. We're going to quite often use an hour of work, but it will include what they get paid per hour plus any fringe benefits. A nominal wage is the amount of money that they receive per hour, day, or year. So it's just their wage in monetary terms, whereas the real wage is the purchasing power of their nominal wage. So let's say a worker earns $10 an hour, that's their nominal wage, but their real wage could be with $10 an hour, they can buy, 4 lattes, for example. And wages differ, among, first of all, occupations. A brain surgeon will earn more than a bank teller. A brain surgeon went to school many more years, and his skills are also more scarce, so he will earn a much higher wage than a bank teller. Also depends on regions. Generally workers in California and New York City, for example, get paid higher than workers here in Houston because the cost of living is higher in those cities. And also, for example, workers in India and China get paid less than workers in the U.S. as well. So, wage differs in different areas, occupations, and regions. Okay, we can see that the hourly pay in Sweden is quite high, almost $50 per hour. Also, note that Sweden pays higher taxes as well. Germany is very high. We go to the United States where it's about $35 an hour, and then we can see, for example, in Mexico and Taiwan where it's less than $10 an hour. Okay, so labor demand depends on productivity. The greater the productivity, the greater the demand for labor is. And U.S. labor is very productive, for several reasons. First, we have access to a lot of capital per worker here in the United States, and capital makes workers more productive. We also have a lot of natural resources, advanced technology. Our computers, for example, are much more advanced than computers you may find, let's say, in South America. Even you might travel to another country and notice their printers seems like something that you would have owned 10 years ago. We have the latest in U.S. technology here in the United States. Labor quality, it's required to go to school till we're 18, and then many of us go to some form of school after high school. And so we are highly skilled labor compared to workers in other countries. And also the environment in the United States plays a factor. What type of laws are there that encourage business growth and production? Do we engage in trade, for example? What's our work culture like, etc.? Okay, so what we see over time is that the real wages in the United States have been moving upward. Again, real wages is measured in terms of purchasing power. And so we can, over time, buy more goods and services with our wages than we could in the past. So, started 1900, 1950, 2000, and then this is estimated real wage in 2020 is going to be higher. And so over time, as technology has increased, firm output has increased, and demand for labor has been shifting to the right. The green line here is a demand, so you can see it's been shifting to the right over time. And since wages have been increasing, workers have been supplying more labor over time. And we see here that productivity has been closely associated with compensation. So as productivity increases, which is the blue line, real hourly compensation has increased. Now, real wages have stagnated in this period, and it's definitely been a concern for economists and policymakers. Okay, so the market demand for labor is the sum of an individual firm's demand for labor. We're going to assume this is a competitive labor market. So, their demand for labor, let's say, is for carpenters. The market supply for labor is upward sloping. And this is because in order for a firm to attract more labor, they will have to pay more money because they're competing among industries for workers. So in order to attract a worker from another industry, then they have to increase the pay that they're offering the workers. And labor market equilibrium, like we worked on last chapter, will be where the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal resource cost. Okay, so on the left here is the labor market. And the supply for labor and demand for labor here determines the equilibrium wage, which is $10. And the individual firm will hire labor up until the marginal resource cost equals the marginal revenue product. Okay, so since this is a perfectly competitive market, the individual firm is a wage taker. So this is why the labor supply is horizontal for the individual firm. They don't have any control over wages. They don't have any power over wages, so they have to offer what the labor market dictates. So they, if profit maximizing quantity of labor is just one worker, then they will hire one worker at $10 an hour. If it's 20 workers, and then we'll hire 20 workers at $10 an hour. Okay. And so the profit maximizing number of workers will be, over here, it's going to be 5, and that's where marginal revenue product equals marginal resource cost. Okay, so moving on from perfect competition, let's look at a monopsony model. And a monopsony is a market with a single employer. The workers are more immobile than we assumed for a perfectly competitive firm. It could be for various reasons. Maybe they're geographically immobile, or there's not many other industries that would hire them with their skills. So in order for them to find another job, they would have to acquire new skills. And the firm, in this case, is a wage maker. So in perfect competition, we assume they're a wage taker. That's why the supply of labor for the individual firm was horizontal. In this case, it's a wage maker, since it has more power. And the wage will vary directly with the number of workers the firm employs. A pure monopsony, if they're the only employer that hires labor in the labor market. And so, an example would be in small towns that exist only because of one firm. So that one firm sets the wages. They have full power over the wages that they hire labor at. In a lot of cases, there may be 3 or 4 firms, so each firm still has an effect on the labor market and the wage, but there's still some competition going on, so it's not as much power as if they were the only firm. So before, for the individual firm, for pure competition, labor supply was horizontal, since they had to they were wage takers. They had to pay workers the wage that the labor market dictated. In this case, for the individual firm, labor supply is upward sloping. They might hire a certain number of workers at a certain wage, but to hire more workers, then they would have to pay a higher wage. And so this leads to marginal resource costs being higher than the wage rate, since wages differ. However, the monopsonist will still hire the quantity of labor, okay, based on where marginal resource cost equals marginal revenue of product, but it will set the wage by tracing down that intersection, and where it hits supply, we would go to the left, and that would determine the equilibrium wage rate. Okay, so we can see here the monopsonist will determine the profit maximizing quantity of labor over here at point B. Okay, that's where marginal resource cost intersects marginal revenue product. And then they will trace it down, okay, and where it hits the supply curve, okay, this will determine the wage that the monopsonist pays their labor. If it were a purely competitive firm, then supply would equal the marginal resource cost. So for a purely competitive firm, this would be the equilibrium. This would be the amount of labor they would hire, and this would have been their wage. So you can see here that in a monopsony, they hire less units of labor, and the equilibrium wage is also lower. And this differential also occurs because, as we've seen in market structures, the different market structures, is that in a purely competitive firm, output tends to be higher than, for example, if the firm was a monopoly or monopolistically competitive firm. And so they produce less output, and they don't need as many workers here. Whereas a purely competitive firm produces more output, and so they need more workers. They hire more workers. Okay, so some example of monopsony power. Nurses skills aren't easily transferable, and so for them to go to another industry to get to receive similar pay, they would have to get retrained in something else. And also, usually the major employers for nurses are in local hospitals. And what's found to be true is that the less hospitals there are in a town or city, the lower the salaries of nurses are. And that's because those hospitals have a greater monopsony power. Okay, if professional athletes, if they didn't have a draft, if first-year players instead could be bid on, whichever team wants to pay the highest gets that player, then first-year players would earn a much higher salary than under the current structure of a draft. With a draft, other teams are not allowed to compete with each other for a certain player, and so starting salaries tend to be lower than if teams could compete with each other for the player. There's also monopsony power when it comes to the demand for labor for teachers. Teachers, just like nurses, have specific skill set that isn't easily transferable to other industries, and also, they're bound by geography. To work as a teacher in another state, there may be different licensing requirements, so they would have to get relicensed all over again, and so it gives, school districts a little bit more power over teachers' wages than otherwise. Okay, so unions increase wage rates. We're going to look at 3 different union models and how they increase wage rates in each of these models. But generally, when a worker's in a union, their wage rate is higher than a worker that is not in a union. Because these workers unionize and then they sell their labor services as a whole, collectively. And then they bargain with firms for higher pay and better benefits. Under the demand enhancement union model, unions aim to increase wage rates by increasing the demand for their labor, and they do this by altering the price of other inputs. So they can do this through, for example, political lobbying. So construction workers will politically lobby for increased spending on construction projects. Therefore, that would increase the demand for construction workers. Teachers unions, they'll lobby for increased public spending on education, new schools, etc. Other unions that face competition from imports will lobby for tariffs or import quotas. This would make imports more expensive, and so firms and consumers will buy more U.S. made goods, and that would increase the demand for U.S. labor. Quite frequently, they will support increases in minimum wage, because right now, a lot of firms will hire lower wage non-union labor instead of union workers, since union workers are more expensive. So if these workers have an increase in wage, then the union's labor is competitive with non-union workers' labor. Okay, so by altering the price of the input, then there will be a shift in the demand for labor to the right, and the wage will increase. So this is the union wage over here, and then wage under perfect competition over here. Another way wage rates can be increased is through a decrease in the supply of labor. And that's what the craft union model does. They lobby to restrict immigration. That way the labor supply stays smaller. They also lobby to reduce child labor for the same reason. They have compulsory retirements. Once a worker reaches a certain age, then they're highly, highly encouraged to retire. And also having a shorter work week. Another way they reduce the labor supply is through what is called exclusive unionism. And so essentially, some workers have a particular skill, such as a brick mason or plumber. And so craft unions, they've banded together and they forced employers to agree to only hire union members. And then they have restrictive memberships. So they have to pay high initiation fees to join the union. They have to have very long apprenticeships. And, they limit the amount of new workers in. And so this keeps labor supply limited and wage rates artificially high. And another way labor supply is restricted is through occupational licensing. So, a cosmetologist needs a license, a lawyer needs a license, a physician needs a license. And so this limits the labor supply. It also helps consumers, right? Because we wouldn't want someone that's not licensed to be our doctor, for example, or a lawyer. But it also limits the labor supply, so that way not anyone can just say, well, I studied this book and I can be a doctor. Okay, so by restricting the labor supply, supply shifts to the left, and union wage here is higher than it would be if there were no unions. Okay, and then we have the industrial union model. It's also called the inclusive union model. And this is where, unlike the craft union model, This is where they try to get all labor, whether they're skilled, semi-skilled, or unskilled, in the union. That way, the union, can strike, and the firms cannot retaliate by hiring workers that are outside of the union. If all the labor supply is in the union, then the firm will have no choice really but to meet the union's demands. And so what ends up happening is the labor supply curve from A, B, E, okay, is perfectly elastic because the firm becomes a wage taker. Since everyone that could be in the union is in the union. Notice here, though, that the union hires workers up to QU. Okay. Now notice the quantity of labor between QU and QE. This is a surplus of labor. These are workers that are unemployed, okay, because wages are being kept above what would normally be an equilibrium wage if there wasn't a union. So, higher wages is a higher cost for firms, and so they can't afford to hire as many workers at higher wages as they would if the workers were not in a union, had lower wages. So this is unemployment over here. Okay. And so this has been a criticism of unions, is that because wages are kept higher than they would be if there was no unions, that unemployment is created. Okay, and then if the firm, for whatever reason, there was an increase in demand for labor and all of union workers have been exhausted and they needed to hire outside of the union, maybe attract new workers to the area, the supply curve would slope upwards again, because to attract new workers, wages would have to be higher, okay, above, if the demand for labor was above QE. Unions are successful in negotiating higher wages. On average, a union member has a 15% higher wage than a non-union member. But, the result, as we saw in the last slide, is there's usually higher unemployment, since, higher wages means higher cost for firms. And also, it's harder for unions to demand higher and higher and higher wages, because the result would be more of its members losing their job. Okay, so the bilateral monopoly model forms when there's a monopsony and an inclusive union. In other words, it results into a single buyer of labor and a single seller of labor. And it's not really all that uncommon. The auto industry is a bilateral monopoly. Steel is a bilateral monopoly, commercial aircraft, etc. Okay, and the outcome depends on the negotiations between the two. There's one major employer, and then, all the labor that the employer wants to hire is in a union. And so, the two sides are going to negotiate, and this usually leads to a desirable outcome. Reason being is because wages won't be as high as if it was a labor union, for example, in a more competitive market. And it won't be as low as if it was a monopsony in a labor market that wasn't unionized. And so what ends up happening is that a lot of times is that the equilibrium wage is somewhere in the middle, and labor hired would be greater than if it was just a monopsony or just a unionized labor market. We'll demonstrate this in the next slide. All right, so a monopsonist is going to hire profit maximizing labor, right? Where marginal revenue product intersects marginal resource cost. Okay, you have QM here. And they're going to pay wage WM. Okay. A labor union wants to set equilibrium wage to WU. Therefore, the supply curve is elastic. Okay. And so if they negotiate and meet somewhere in the middle, and let's say they decide on a price of WC, okay, since that is a negotiated rate for a worker, it also becomes the firm's marginal resource cost over here. And what we see is it also looks like the purely competitive outcome. So this is the wage rate per worker in this case, since it's negotiated. It intersects the marginal revenue product. And we see that more units of labor are employed too. So each side gives up something but also gains something as well. And we have a better outcome of more persons employed. Okay, so there's a minimum wage controversy in the sense that, minimum wage keeps certain wages above equilibrium, creating some level of unemployment. And so some, politicians will say we should abolish the minimum wage, that businesses would hire more workers if they could pay a more competitive wage than instead of having to be forced to pay the federal level of $7.25 or even higher, because states can set their own minimum wage. So, for example, in Washington, wage was $9.19 an hour. And cities can also set their own minimum wage. And Seattle, just last year set their minimum wage to $15 an hour. Proponents for minimum wage will say that it doesn't really create a lot of unemployment, especially if it's in a labor market where employers have monopsony power. Okay. So since these firms now have to pay a minimum wage, then they have to hire the amount of labor that would create the profit maximizing output, and that amount of labor would actually be higher with a minimum wage than without. Also, others will say that, okay, if you pay workers more, so let's say a firm wanted to pay workers $5, but now they have to pay them $7.25. Since these workers now have a higher income, they're buying more goods and services. This increases output for firms and also increases profits as well. And other proponents will say that a higher wage will increase the productivity of workers and decrease labor turnover. The overall evidence shows that, the minimum wage is low and it doesn't keep up with the cost of living. It depends on congressional approval for it to be raised, and that doesn't happen very often. And so that there's actually very little unemployment caused by minimum wage, and most of it that is caused is it affects teenagers, because they are the group most likely to be the ones earning minimum wage. So estimate says that a 10% increase in minimum wage will cause about a 1 to 3% decrease in unemployment. Okay, so wage differentials are the difference in wage received by one group of people than another group of people. So, for example, surgeons earn much more than fast food cooks per year. And, surgeons, petroleum engineers, for example, they go through much more schooling and their skill set is more scarce, and so that is reflected in their higher wage than, for example, for childcare workers, fast food cooks, or janitors. Okay, in graphs A and B, the wage differential is caused by a difference in demand for labor. So in an area where demand for that type of labor is high, wage will be higher than in another industry where demand for workers is low. And then in C and D, the wage differentials here is caused by a difference in supply of labor. So in industries where supply of labor is low, this would be graph C, wage is higher than in industries where there's a high supply of labor. Okay, so some explanations for the differences in wages. One would be marginal revenue productivity. And again, this is the change in total revenue when an additional unit of a resource is employed. Okay, so for example, the marginal revenue of productivity of a professional sports player is very high. A good player will attract people to come see the team play. Also, they're used in endorsements, and so they bring revenue for the companies that are sponsoring the products, etc. And so the marginal revenue productivity is high, and so in turn, the player gets a very high salary. Also, these workers are in non-competing groups. Essentially, they don't compete with each other for employment because their skills and trainings are so different from workers in other groups. So, for example, a professional basketball player does not compete with a professional violin player for a job. Their skill set is completely different. And also education and training, to be a professor at a 4-year university, a person needs to have a PhD most of the time. And so someone with a bachelor's degree would not be able to get the same job that someone with a PhD would at a university level. And we find for the most part that, higher attainment of education usually results in higher wages. And then compensating differences, these are basically wage differentials that result because, one job may be more dangerous than another job, and so they're being compensated for the danger, for example. So, like a construction worker has a pretty dangerous job. There's a risk of falling, injuring themselves, even killing themselves. It's very hard on their body, and their employment depends on, really the economy, how many construction projects there are going. And so they get paid higher, for example, than someone who's a bank teller. They usually sit in an air-conditioned bank. There's not too much of a hazard there. And also, you'll find that like a nurse that works the night shift will get paid more than a nurse that works a day shift, just because it's harder on a person to work a night shift. And some justification for higher education, professional degree holders earn much more money than people with bachelor's degree. And professional degree, is master's, PhD, or something like a JD or a medical degree, MBA, etc. And so a bachelor's degree holder gets paid more than an associate's degree holder, and then associate's degree holder gets paid more than someone with just a high school diploma. All right, so stay in school. Okay, so sometimes wage differentials also occur because of market imperfections. There can be a lack of job information. Essentially, persons are not aware that they can get paid better in another geographic location or just going to another industry. Also, geographic immobility. A lot of people don't want to move away. They could have better opportunities and higher paying jobs somewhere else, but they don't want to leave their friends, family, or they just like where they live, and so they don't want to leave that certain scenery. Unions, of course, because someone in a union will get paid more usually than someone doing the same work outside of a union. And also, some of the immobility is created because, the government restrains someone to practice, let's say, law in all 50 states unless they have passed the bar in all 50 states. And so, having to study for a new bar and taking that bar can be very daunting for a person, and so therefore they don't move. And also discrimination, kind of a hot topic, but we see women being paid less than men for the same work, or some firms prefer only to hire people from a certain race or a certain sex. Up until now, we have been assuming that a worker gets paid for a standard wage per hour, but usually a lot of salaries are a little more complex. They get, like, workers are rated on a scale, and then their wage and bonus depends on how the rating is. And this can eliminate the principal agent problem. The firm is the principal and the workers are the agents. And so they should have a common interest, and that's, for the firm to maximize profit and do well. But sometimes the interests don't align, and workers may blow off their job, and when they think they're not being monitored, may not do so well and leave early or arrive late, for example, or lie about their vacation time, etc. And so a performance-based plan may help eliminate the incentive for the agents, which are the employees, to, blow off their work. So, there's different types of incentive pay plans, like piece rates, and this is where a worker gets paid by their output. So the more output they produce, the higher their pay is, versus getting just the standard wage per hour. Also, commissions or royalties can be used. Commissions are a percentage of the monetary value of a sale. So a lot of insurance agents, real estate agents, etc., they'll get commissions on their sales. And then royalties are a percentage of sales revenue from a work. So, musicians, authors, they usually are paid royalty. And so this helps align the firm's profit maximizing incentive with, for example, it could be the recording artists and authors or the real estate agent, etc. Okay, bonuses are an additional payment on top of salary or wage. So if an employee does exceptionally well, they might earn a great bonus. Also, they might be offered stock options. It helps, this allows workers to buy their employer's stock. And so, if their employer is doing better, then their personal stock does better too. And so it gives a good incentive for the employee to do well. And also profit sharing plans. A profit sharing plan will allow an employee to get a certain percentage of a firm's profit. And then efficiency wages is the theory that if you pay a worker a higher than average wage, then they will work for you harder. Okay. Of course, there's a trade-off to all of these plans. For piece rates, this might encourage poor quality work. If you're getting paid based on output, then your goal is to produce as much output as possible, but that might involve you taking shortcuts and quality of the product falling. For commissions and royalties, so in order, for example, for real estate agent to sell their house, they might engage in some kind of shady behavior so that way they can get their commission. Okay, stock options can sometimes give an incentive for executives to lie about how well the firm is doing, so that way the stock value increases. So Enron is a perfect example of a stock option incentive gone wrong. And a firm that pays efficiency wages usually will hire less workers since these workers cost more. And so there could be a loss of brain power in the workplace. United States CEO salaries are the highest in the world, essentially. And, lately there's been kind of an outcry against it because sometimes these CEOs make bad decisions and the company goes under, but they still walk away with handsome pay, or they might lay off a lot of workers, but yet their pay might be higher than ever. And so, some people will say CEOs, to attract the best of the best, we should pay them high because their decisions will then increase, productivity will increase, firm revenue and profits. A lot of board members have been CEO or worked at some executive level in another firm, so they're usually in support of a CEO receiving incredibly high pay. And it's not that people argue that they should receive higher pay than anyone else in the company, but it's that do they need pay to be so high? So it's an unsettled issue, and it's still debated today. And a lot of people will point out during the financial crisis. So, for example, when Lehman Brothers went under, the CEO walked away with a $500 million compensation package. And so critics will argue that, this is ridiculous and that CEO pay has gone out of control. All right, so this concludes chapter 15.